Al Capone's iron grip on the Chicago underworld is legendary, but few people know the truth about his utterly embarrassing end. Al Capone is the most infamous gangster in American history. This larger-than-life figure terrorized the streets of prohibition-era Chicago, yet his boisterous personality and extravagant lifestyle made him a national celebrity. But the life Al Capone lived came with a heavy price. When his end finally came, it was absolutely brutal, but it was one crazy ride while it lasted. Al Capone's origins were similar to many Americans. Born in Brooklyn, New York, to working-class Italian immigrants, he grew up in a hectic household. Young Alfonse Capone shared a small apartment with his parents and 7 siblings. It didn't take long before young Al Capone started making a name for himself, but for all the wrong reasons. He went to an incredibly strict Catholic school, and in case you couldn't guess, Capone had some issues with authority. A confrontation with a teacher turned violent, and Capone punched her square in the face. The school expelled him immediately, but Capone wasn't too broken up about it. Anyone could tell that school was not in his future. Once school kicked him out, Capone couldn't just laze around the house all day. He came from a working-class family, so his family expected him to work. He found odd jobs across Brooklyn, from a candy store to a bowling alley. After keeping mostly on the straight and narrow for the rest of his teenage years, Capone met a man who'd set him on the path to infamy. Teenage boys look for father figures all over, and Al Capone found one in Johnny Torrio. Torrio was tough, confident, and bursting with charisma. He also happened to be an infamous gangster. Capone looked up to Torrio and learned all the wrong lessons from him. Pretty soon, young Al Capone would be doing a lot worse than punching teachers. It was only a matter of time before he fell in with one of the street gangs in the city. He started off with small-time outfits like the Junior 40 Thieves and the Bowery Boys. Soon enough, he'd join up with the Brooklyn Rippers, and then moved on to the infamous 5 Points gang. Capone learned from a young age that a life of crime brought money, women, and the power he craved. He also learned the hard way that it came with a price. Around this time, Capone found another not-so-reputable role model in Frankie Yale. Yale was a bartender at a Coney Island dance hall called the Harvard Inn. With his hulking frame and violent tendencies, Capone was an obvious choice to bring in as a bouncer, even though he was still a teenager. While working at the Harvard Inn, Capone would earn the infamous nickname he'd carry for the rest of his life. The youthful and cocky Capone insulted a woman one night while working at the door of the Harvard Inn. What he didn't realize was that the girl had a brother with her that night, a man named Frankie Galluccio. Galluccio attacked him with a knife, brutally slashing him 3 times across the face. And Scarface was born that night. The nickname followed Capone for the rest of his life. But whether he liked it or not, Al Capone would be Scarface from that night on. At least the wounds didn't scare off one May Coughlin, the love of Al Capone's life. Al Capone met May Coughlin on the streets of New York City when he was still figuring out his path in the world. The pair gave birth to a son, Sonny Capone, when they were still teenagers. They married 3 weeks later with permission from both their parents. If only poor May Coughlin had known the kind of life that she was signing up for. When you think Al Capone, you think Chicago, not New York City. That's all thanks to Capone's old mentor, Johnny Torrio. Chicago mob boss James Colosimo, or Big Jim, recruited Torrio to come work for him as an enforcer around 1919. Torrio saw big things in Capone and invited him to head out west with him. Al Capone's first gig in Chicago was as a bouncer at a local cat house. Capone apparently hadn't heard the phrase, "Don't dip your pen in the company ink," because he became a regular himself. But believe it or not, 1920 Chicago cat houses weren't exactly the cleanest places. Capone contracted syphilis, a disease that would slowly eat away at him until there was almost nothing left. But for now, Capone was still young, strong, and hungry. In 1920, law enforcement officials found Big Jim full of bullet holes outside of his restaurant. As his second-in-command, Capone's buddy John Torrio took over from there. Officers never proved who did it, but this was around the time that they started hearing about a young thug named Al Capone. Though Torrio and Capone had worked for Big Jim, they also had a very good reason to want him out of the picture. Ever heard of a little thing called prohibition? The ban on alcoholic beverages across the United States ironically provided a huge opportunity for gangsters who played fast and loose with the law to begin with. John Torrio saw dollar signs, but for whatever reason, Big Jim was firmly against getting into the bootlegging business. Once Big Jim was gone, Torrio quickly started getting rich through, you guessed it, bootlegging. No one ever proved it, but most people agree that Torrio ordered the hit on Big Jim. What's more, many have speculated that Capone himself might have been the triggerman. Al Capone was a small-time thug no longer. Johnny Torrio's mostly Italian gang was the biggest in Chicago, and Capone served as his right-hand man. They made money hand over fist with their bootlegging enterprise. Torrio and Capone's setup was the biggest in the city, but there was plenty of other gangs who would kill for that place at the top of the mountain. One of those rivals was Dean O'Banion, who led the Northside Gang. Their feud escalated until it reached a breaking point. Torrio and Capone hired several men to shoot O'Banion at his flower shop in 1924, but getting rid of O'Banion only put a target on Capone and Torrio's back. When O'Banion bit the bullet, the ruthless Jaime Weiss took his place at the head of the gang. Along with his infamous lieutenant Bugs Morin, Weiss had considered O'Banion a close friend. When he took the reins, he had one thing on his mind: revenge. Weiss came for Al Capone first. In January 1925, a crew of men from the Northside Gang ambushed Capone in the street. By some miracle, he walked away from the encounter unscathed. But it still shook him to his core. When it came time for Johnny Torrio, he wasn't nearly as lucky. Just 12 days after the Capone ambush, another Northside crew attacked Torrio while he was returning from a shopping trip. He somehow managed to cling to life, but the experience made him take a hard look at his life. Torrio's days with the Chicago outfit were coming to a close, but that meant big things for Al Capone. Johnny Torrio decided that the bootlegging money wasn't worth putting his life on the line. He left that life mostly behind him and handed the reins to his second-in-command, Al Capone. Capone was only 26 years old, and he found himself the boss of one of the biggest country's most profitable bootlegging outfits. But while Torrio had avoided strong-arm tactics whenever possible, Capone didn't have such qualms. The Chicago outfit was about to start raking in even more cash than ever. Capone's disturbing methods saw to that. Chicago quickly became a terrifying place to live once Al Capone took over. He would do anything to expand his empire, including blowing up any establishment that refused to purchase from him. The resulting explosions claimed the lives of over 100 people throughout the 1920s. Once he took over the Chicago outfit, Al Capone single-handedly started turning the city into a sinner's paradise. While Capone's public persona as a larger-than-life gangster grew and grew, it took a terrible toll on the people who loved him most. While Capone was outliving the high life, his wife and son remained at home, still almost entirely isolated from his extravagant lifestyle. May and Sonny Capone lived a remarkably normal existence while he spent his days shooting rivals, drinking, and womanizing. Though he tried to hide his activities from his wife, May Capone wasn't stupid. She knew something was going on, and later in life, she made a heartbreaking confession. The worst part seems to have been Capone's infidelity. May once told her son, "Don't do what your father did. He broke my heart." But May's heartbreak couldn't stop Al Capone now. He was fast on his way to becoming a national icon. Americans couldn't get enough of Al Capone. This Scarface, well-dressed kingpin seemed like he was straight out of a Hollywood movie. Is it any wonder why they've made so many pictures about him? Capone became a national celebrity, and his cheeky attitude only endeared the people to him even more. But no matter how glamorous Capone's life seemed to the casual observer, the dark side to his bootlegging business couldn't stay under wraps for long. As Capone's bootlegging business grew, so did the feud between his Chicago outfit and the Northside Gang. Capone's longtime driver went missing. When officers found him, the scene was utterly gruesome. The state of his body implied that his end had not been pretty. Capone planned a hit on Jaime Weiss in retaliation, but his men failed and Weiss survived. When the attempt on Weiss's life failed, Capone must have known what was coming next. In September 1926, Capone was inside his headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn when he heard a commotion outside. He ventured to the window to see what all the fuss was about, totally unaware that's exactly what his enemies wanted. A car full of men from the Northside Gang opened fire, riddling the restaurant with holes. But Al Capone was a lot more slippery than they'd assumed. Capone was absolutely ruthless, but he definitely did not have a death wish, and he decided it was time to end the feud. He called for a truce, but Weiss refused. Weiss was out for revenge, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it, or until he ended up 6 feet under himself. Just 3 weeks after Capone called a truce, a group of gunmen opened fire on Jaime Weiss, and they didn't miss. As the feud with the Northside Gang went on, he grew more and more paranoid, and he started looking for every opportunity to leave the city. But just because he was nervous didn't mean Capone was going to stop living life. Pinning down Al Capone was no easy task. He never registered any property under his name, and had all kinds of places to stay in the outside of Chicago. His bootlegging enterprise made him a very rich man, but the authorities found proving that to be another story. He never opened a bank account, and only used Western Union to deliver money, and never more than $1,000 at a time. This kind of caution helped make Capone as successful as he was, but no one can remain in this line of work forever. Bootlegging made too many enemies, and Capone's were starting to close in. The feud with the Northside Gang was only one conflict in Capone's life. He got involved with another organization that claimed to be charitable, but was actually overrun with gangsters. He got one Antonio Lombardo, named head of the society, which infuriated another gangster, Joe Aiello, who wanted that position for himself. Joe soon proved far more dangerous than he first appeared. In retaliation, Joe allied himself with several of Capone's enemies, forming a coalition that grew powerful enough to threaten Capone's Chicago outfit. But Joe struggled to beat Capone at his own game, so he came up with a chilling plan to get his revenge a little more directly. He hired several men to take out Capone in early 1927. He even tried to get one of Capone's own men to betray him. He offered the chef at Capone's favorite restaurant a huge sum to put acid in Capone's soup. But Joe underestimated the loyalty that Capone instilled in those close to him. Evidently, Capone treated the chef at his favorite restaurant properly. Rather than take Joe's money, the chef went straight to Capone himself and revealed the plot. Capone responded by sending a group of men in a car to Joe's brother's bakery. Capone's men fired a whopping 200 shots into the establishment, severely wounding Joe's brother. Now, Joe wanted blood, and he'd stop at nothing to get it. Throughout 1927, he offered several men upwards of $25,000 if they could take out the infamous gangster. Hitman after hitman went after Capone, and they all ended up slain for their troubles. It seemed as though Capone was invincible. Joe planned ambushes on Capone and several of his allies. Before the plan came to fruition, an anonymous tip sent law enforcement to several of Joe's addresses, with officers capturing several of his chief lieutenants and gunmen. It was a disaster for Joe, but it was about to get even worse. One gunman confessed that Joe had hired him to take out Capone and several of his men. That was all the officers needed, and they subsequently hauled Joe himself down to the station. He was in some serious trouble now. Not long after officers brought in Joe, several shady-looking men started appearing outside the station. They were Capone's men, and they made their purpose there very clear. The second Joe left the station, he was doomed. Word spread, and reporters flocked to the scene. They were anxiously waiting for the drama to unfold. Two of Capone's men tried to force their way into the station, so officers cuffed them and threw them into the cell next to Joe's. From there, the men taunted him. Panicked, Joe begged for mercy, promising to sell all his possessions and leave Chicago immediately. He eventually left the station, with an escort of course, and made it out alive. He fled the city soon after, and Capone returned to business as usual. Joe would reappear later, but for now, Capone had bigger fish to fry. Capone seemed unstoppable, and he must have felt it too. The most disturbing day of his entire reign of terror was just around the corner. There was still the Northside Gang to consider. With Bugs Moran now at the helm, the Northsiders still managed to be a thorn in Capone's side. The feud had been going on for the better part of 5 years now, and Capone decided enough was enough. On Thursday, February 14th, 1929, 4 uniformed officers raided Bugs Moran's headquarters at a warehouse in Chicago's North Side. The officers found 7 men inside and ordered them to line up against the wall. Moran's men had no choice but to comply. When they realized what was happening, it was too late. The officers were actually Capone's men in disguise, and they opened fire. The Valentine's Day massacre was absolutely brutal. Photos of the slain men, lying in a heap, spread throughout the city like wildfire. Capone was at his home in Florida when the shooting occurred, but everyone knew he was behind it. His reputation plummeted. Though the people had loved him before, it became hard to reconcile the charismatic, larger-than-life figure with the horrific brutality of the photographs. Al Capone went into damage control mode after Valentine's Day. As it was the early days of the Great Depression, he opened a soup kitchen and donated heavily to various charities. But that wasn't enough to make people forget about the bloodshed. Many in Chicago were fed up with Capone's reign of terror, and one man decided it was time to act. The horror on Valentine's Day had been too much for Walter A. Strong, publisher of the Chicago Daily News. Strong wanted someone to deal with Capone, and he happened to have some powerful friends. Strong enlisted the help of President Herbert Hoover himself. Hoover resolved to deal with Capone and curb the lawlessness that had gripped Chicago for over a decade. Capone had bought off everyone in town, from politicians to judges to officers. That was about to end. The president enlisted the FBI to get Al Capone off the streets once and for all. This is where Elliot Ness entered the picture. In a city where everyone could be bought for a price, Ness and his men were incorruptible. Walter A. Strong's own Chicago Daily News dubbed them the Untouchables. Al Capone had faced plenty of adversaries before, and he'd triumphed every time. But this was going to be different. Throughout his years as Chicago's chief gangster, Al Capone had done a remarkable job of staying out of jail. His streak finally broke in 1929. FBI agents apprehended him outside of a courtroom where he'd just testified. Everyone knew Capone was one of the most brutal men in the country, but the best they could do was charge him with contempt of court. Less than 2 months later, officers caught Capone again, this time in Philadelphia. They charged him with carrying a concealed weapon, and for the first time ever, managed to put Capone behind bars. For his years of bloodshed and bootlegging, the punishment he ended up getting was almost laughable. The courts sentenced Capone to 1 year to be served at Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. He spent his time in luxury, with his own cozy cell decorated with fine furniture and art. He had a top-of-the-line radio and liked to sit and peacefully listen to waltzes to pass the time. Capone only ended up serving 7 months in that cell before hitting the streets once more. Capone's first stint behind bars was a cruel joke to anyone in the FBI who wanted to take him down for good. He walked out of Eastern State Penitentiary a free man. But he wasn't out of the woods yet. The FBI named him Public Enemy Number 1 and continued their campaign to bring him down for good. So did Capone decide to start laying low and take it easy? Of course not. Capone usually paid other men to do his dirty work for him, but he didn't always keep his hands clean. Remember Joe, the rival whom Capone had run out of town? Apparently he hadn't given up on his crusade against him. One of Capone's bodyguards uncovered the plot to betray him. This time, Capone decided to deal with the traitors personally. He allegedly captured the 3 men and viciously beat them with a baseball bat, before ordering his bodyguards to shoot them. With those men dealt with, Al Capone set his sights on Joe. On October 23, 1930, he left the building and made a beeline for the nearest taxi, but he wasn't fast enough. Capone's men shot Joe at least 13 times before he managed to flee around the corner. However, that only brought him directly in front of the second car of Capone's men. Joe would trouble Al Capone no more. Most of the people who were following Al Capone's exploits expected someone like the dashing Elliot Ness to take him down in a dramatic shootout or something like that, but that's not how it went down.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
The person who finally cracked how to take down Al Capone was no FBI agent or maverick officer. It was the Assistant Attorney General, Mabel Walker Wilbrandt. After the authorities had struggled for so many years with how to actually pin anything on Capone, Wilbrandt suddenly had an epiphany. Al Capone had committed any number of brutal felonies, and the one that brought him down, in the end, was tax evasion. Federal courts ended up convicting Capone on 5 counts of income tax evasion, amounting in $215,000 plus interest. That was the smoking gun they used to sentence him to 11 years behind bars. If you think that 11 years seems too light for all the things that Al Capone had done, he ended up suffering a fate worse than any prison sentence. Upon arrival at Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary, doctors found him in terrible shape. He suffered from both syphilis and gonorrhea, as well as withdrawal from a nasty cocaine addiction that left him with a perforated nasal septum. He lived about as hard and as fast as any man ever could, and at 33, his body and mind had already begun to crumble. He grew frail and weak from his various ailments, and proved completely unable to defend himself from the other prisoners' torment. After just a few years in Atlanta, authorities transferred Capone to the infamous Alcatraz. There, he entered a whole new nightmare. While the other inmates were cruel, Capone's biggest battle was with himself. Capone had first contracted syphilis as a teenager, and the disease had ravaged his body. By the time he arrived at Alcatraz, the effects were absolutely chilling. Syphilis slowly wore away at Capone, leaving him weaker and weaker with each passing day. He spent his final years at Alcatraz in the hospital wing, completely confused and disoriented. By 1939, he was transferred to a less secure facility, and later that year, his long-suffering wife organized his release based on his reduced mental state. Capone spent the final years of his life at a mansion in Palm Island, Florida, surrounded by his wife and grandchildren. Syphilis continued to eat away at his brain. By 1946, his doctor determined that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Anyone who saw him would struggle to recognize the most feared gangster in the history of the United States. In January 1947, he suffered a stroke. Though he initially seemed to recover, he had a heart attack the next day. he passed peacefully on January 25, 1947, surrounded by his loved ones at his home. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want a say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.